On September 17th, I received an email from Oliver Wise. It stated, could you moderate a panel at the CFA Summit on analytics? And I said, sure, who's on the panel? And then he sent me the list of who's on the panel, and I said, oh, you need a lady. So I'm the lady. I'm the pretty face. And that's why, I'm gonna invite all the girls to sit up front and like get my riot girl on, and I'm really taking over. So I've decided to dominate the entire panel. Hope that's cool with everybody. So yeah, that's right. Thank you. And I now realize that the riot girl comment probably is falling on very deaf ears. Okay. So, in all honesty, this is actually probably going to be, in my opinion, one of the most compelling panels, not just because I get to be the moderator and run this thing, but because of the content and the subject matter expertise that we have with us today. And so we're here to talk about analytics, which I think has, it is like the, hopefully not just the new buzzword in government. And hopefully we can talk about really sort of the nuts and bolts. And the idea today is to really help you to understand what does it mean from a practitioner's perspective, and then how we can really think about the use of data and analytics in a way that is going to tremendously have massive impacts on the lives of people living in our cities. And so the first thing I'd like to do is just, I'm Beth. I'm the director of the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. We are a completely new center. So we just got stood up in April out of from a very generous and initial gift from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And we're working primarily with the What Works Cities initiative, where we're helping 100 mid-sized cities use data and evidence more robustly in their daily work. And we can talk in more detail about that at another time, because that's not why we're here. So I want to make sure that these guys get to introduce themselves, and then we'll have a nice conversation. So I want to maybe start with Avi.
Sure. Thank you all for being here. Hi, my name's Avi Namani, and Beth, you're actually the star of this show, so I don't know what you're talking about. So until recently, literally 1 week ago, I was the Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles, and now there's another mic. And there I headed up data analytics, open data, and digital service delivery, which we'll talk about more. Before that, I hung out here a little bit at Code for America. I was here for about 4 or 5 years, helping launch the Code for America program, and actually ran this conference through a couple years. So it's good to be back.
Sure. I'm Oliver. I'm director of the Office of Performance and Accountability in the City of New Orleans. And we started as the city's performance management shop. So our charge was to help departments and the mayor set goals and then track performance and get results. But over the last year and a half or so, we started the journey extending that work into analytics. And I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes.
And I'm Mike Flowers. I was the Chief Analytics Officer for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, and am now Chief Analytics Officer for Enigma Technologies, a startup in southern Manhattan, or lower Manhattan, excuse me. And I do a bunch of side projects generally involving cities, trying to get these programs off the ground. And, I think I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody else has gone through on this, to be honest with you, because I realize more than anyone how hard it is to get these things going. And so I think if I were you, I'd be listening as much for what didn't work as what did.
Which is a good place to start. I think the first time I met Mike Flowers was in Washington, D.C., and I told him that I was the state stat director for the state of Maryland, and I'm pretty sure it was, "I fucking hate you people," was the first thing that was said.
Is it late enough for that kind of
language? But I'm pretty sure that that's exactly how it went.
I smiled.
Yeah, he smiled the entire time he was saying it, but that's exactly how it went. And I think that, and so and it was like one of the most fascinating responses, because that wasn't usually the response that I got when I got to talk about what I was doing for work. And then when we started to kind of probe why that was, I think we got to like the root of some really interesting, it really provoked a lot of thinking for me from the perspective of what we were doing in Maryland and where I wanted to really advance the field. And also for getting insight into how it was working in New York City, and this like idea that there can be a really good, healthy tension between setting priorities and measuring priorities, and actually the analytics work that's required to like deliver services and to help to have an impact on those outcomes. And so I would love to get just from all of you at the panel just sort of an overview, and maybe we can start with you, Oliver, on like how did you get to this point? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to take that?
No.
There's a performance stat emergency in NOLA that he's got to deal with.
If we were in
My
Broadway,
sister on
you'd be
my flip
called out.
phone.
Oh my God, that really is a flip phone. That's amazing.
Those still
government.
exist?
Are you burning that later? What's going on? Okay. So, anyways, why don't you talk a little bit about how you got started and sort of, and really just like found the things that you talked about in your email.
Yeah, sure. Well, so we spent the first term of Mayor Landrieu's tenure setting up a STAT program, really modeled over what you developed in Maryland and similar ones like that, but I think you had the best one going at the time, where it's really about having strategy, having focused goals, and then using data as a way to create a feedback loop for those goals. And I think the theory of change there is you inject some accountability and transparency for meeting those goals. And you don't want to, it shouldn't be a bash over the head type of thing, but you do inject some healthy tension, hopefully healthy tension for meeting those goals. And then in doing so, you drive improvements and hopefully you get results that way. And that's what we had set up, and we got lots of wins through that, and it was great. But then read about what Mike was doing, and we had and I read that article in the New York Times that I think everyone else and their mother read.
Not mine.
I seriously got that.
And when I read that article, I think there's like, what is this analytics thing? I think it's not even clear what the deliverable is. And I initially thought, and maybe other people were silly enough to have the same impression, but I thought it was about a platform, and it was about some like mega data integration initiative to get this Uber map that has everything, and you'll be able to generate all these insights if you just integrate all your data and you have this beautiful map. But it wasn't that at all. It was really about a process and a shift in perspective of how that data could be used. And I remember your advice, which was look for where the backlogs are, look for where your departments have pain points, and then see if you can deliver some intervention that's based on an analysis and data science to help relieve that tension so that they can do the most impactful work first. You can talk a lot about your examples you did there, but that was a horizon expanding phone call, because it really is a different mindset than performance management, which is about ratcheting up tension. And I think what the perspective in analytics is it's really about decreasing that tension, or finding a way for that department who's having challenges, a way for them to work smarter, not just harder.
Yeah. You want me to go?
Yeah.
All right. So it wasn't the first thing I said, but
I think it was, yeah.
But I guess, alluding to the difference between, Oliver puts better, frankly, than anybody I've heard, what I view a successful or good analytics program to be, which is, that delta from external pressure to giving them a hand with fixing the things we highlight to be problematic, right? And so, those KPI programs, those STAT programs, I think they're insanely valuable, right? In terms of highlighting where we're not doing so great, right? My problem with them is sort of twofold, right? First, they have a tendency, because it's just much easier to measure volume of work than it is impact you're having. And it is easier to do it that way. That becomes the focus, and you get these really perverse incentives. Where, okay, well, I need to do the X amount of inspections a month because last year we were doing fewer, and that's what they're gonna look at that delta as being bad, and I'm gonna get yelled at, and they're gonna cut my budget and all this stuff, right? And so if you go to them with a solution that basically says, well, I'm less concerned about how much you did, but get to the really bad ones, and the KPI that they really care, the key performance indicators, doesn't take that into account, then they actually resist becoming more effective, and I don't blame them for it. So, I guess the point I was trying to make with you was I come from a strong civil servant background, right? And I was always very empathetic to when they would come home and really bitch about how stupid some of these programs were. And my view was like, all right, well, let's we're going to highlight these things where they're not doing as great as they should, but then it's on us to step in and figure out how to help them get through what we've just highlighted as a bad thing. So I think they are in fact very complementary when executed the right way.
Yeah, and I was joking to a certain extent about that, but I do sort of. I mean, I know you still fucking hate me. No, just kidding. But I do.
Not true.
I know, it's very not true. But I think that just to before we move on to Abby, I think that there is this we learn from our growth, right? And so we learned a lot from the mistakes that were made in ComStat and when we were doing CityStat, and we learned a lot from the challenges scaling from a citywide level to doing it at a statewide level. And we evolved, right, the process. So performance stat, at its core, the tenets of performance stat are, really trying to do the inverse of creating those perverse incentives. They really are trying to unearth the opportunities so that you can really invest in what is working. But it really does, depend on sort of the administration of how you're doing those things, and the field needs to evolve, right? And so I think when I read the article in the Times, I thought, geez, this is the evolution of the work that we've sort of been priming the pump for. And so now that we're having this impact on the culture of government and trying to get that data flowing and try to get people more comfortable with using data and to really eradicate a culture of data hoarding in government, now that we've sort of had an impact on that, so what does that now look like? And what is that value that we can bring back to government and say, we can help you with some of these most lasting and protracted problems? And I think that is when I saw it, and that was sort of the opportunity that really called at me. And I want to learn more from your experience and kind of what drew you from the cushy life of Code for America into public service, right? And I think that
I just didn't like working with Bob Softman was really what it was. So my first day at the city, my former boss, Rick Cole, invited me into a cabinet meeting with the mayor, and we're going to keep talking about this New York Times article because we should talk about that. But the mayor said, he introduced me to the rest of the cabinet saying, here's Avi Namani, our first chief data officer, and the reason you should care about data is this Times article, right? And you should see all the great stuff that Flowers and his team did in New York, and Avi's going to do all that there. I pretty much fell on the floor and almost died. But he also made the point that he's our first chief data officer, maybe not the best, just friendly. But what was interesting about that is I thought I was taking the job to run open data for the city, right? And to help make open data useful and effective. But it turned out that the policy leaders, particularly the mayor, really wanted to use data to put it to work. And so that changed the way I thought about my job. And I know Tim is here from Philly, and I know he runs the Open Data program and also does analytics work as well, and he can speak to this. But what I learned was that Open Data was actually a really nice entry point to start doing analytics work with departments, right? So I went from department to department saying, hey, what data do you have? Can we open that? And they're like, Avi, why should I open up this data? It was hard for me to answer that question, right? And we can talk more about open data and how the value from that comes. But what I ended up doing was saying, if you open up this data, we can help solve policy problems for you, right? And so that's the turn that we made, is we basically used open data as the entry point. and then turned it into an analytics problem or opportunity. And that's how we started to get traction with departments to actually start doing problem solving and do policy making through data. And it actually helped the open data movement, by the way.
Yeah, and I think that is a very strong point, and one that I'm really focused on, which is, barfing data out into a market that doesn't have value and isn't well maintained.
Did you work for Socrata before?
Doesn't do anything. Yeah, I did very proudly. And I think that, whether it's Socrata or whether you're using Decan or whether you're using Acela or Esri or whoever you're using, it's great that you've made this commitment to wanting to share information and data with the world, but do it with purpose and be the first consumer of that data. And I think that is a mistake that the movement itself made that we should all be learning from, which is you can't expect the public to be the first consumer of your data, that you have to be an internal consumer of that data, because you will inherently improve the value of that data. You will have a huge impact on outcomes in your government or in your community or wherever you're trying to have that impact. And it will last. It'll be lasting because people will start to really rely on the relationships that you're making. The technology is so minor compared to the relationships, the governance, the structure that you're putting into place in your programs. And that, I think, is something that oftentimes very early on, when transparency was the focus, fell on deaf ears.
And one thing there's a lot of really good points being made, and one thing I kind of want to make clear, when I started, it was year 9 of a 12-year administration, right? So there was significant infrastructure laid. Of course, I really did have fantastic support from senior leadership, and I realize as I go out amongst the world and see other things, but including in the private sector, that was a luxury that many people don't have, right? But more to the point, there was a robust performance management culture, right? So they were already used to getting counted. There was a significant open data effort, right? There was a gentleman named Andrew Nicklin, who now works with Beth, who I think actually was, quite heroic in what he was doing, because he was working at it from an agency. He didn't even have really a mayoral remit. He was just a career civil servant who believed in the concept and ran around knocking on doors begging for thumb drives, and then kind of posted it to our earliest iteration of an open data page, which was called New York City Data Mine. And I had nothing to do with any of that, right? I came in, and that was part of the landscape I surveyed, and then built, I guess, the analytics effort on top of that infrastructure. So your point about the evolutionary aspect of it, I think, is spot on. You have an open data program that was existing. You have a robust performance management program that was just doing a wonderful job meeting its goals, right, in terms of measurement. And then the step after that is, let's merge those two and come up with a way to optimize service delivery.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I would just say the thing I learned, again, I was only in city government for a year, but at Coach America we work with city governments for a while, but these things take time, right? You can't just jump in one day and just start saying we're going to go change the entire way we do policy making to make it all data driven. You just can't. And so you start by changing perspectives a little bit. Actually, the best compliment I ever got was leaving a meeting and someone saying, Avi, you've actually changed the way we think about solving this problem. They didn't actually change the way they solved the problem, right? But they changed the way they thought about solving the problem, right? And that's huge for the start, right? And then over time, you build the infrastructure. Over time, you start to build the processes. And over time, you start to actually change the way things happen. So I think Mike's point is dead on, and Beth's point is dead on, is that this is an arc. Right?
And if anything, Oliver represents a very condensed version of it, because he started the performance management thing. Yeah. He's the one who started running around putting data on the open data page, and then now he's the one launching the analytics effort. So what impresses me the most about what Oliver's done is that he's managed to do it in a much faster time frame with much fewer resources, right? And is executing beautifully, seeing real outcomes being generated on behalf of the citizenry. So I think, one of the key takeaways here is what I'd like to find out from you, in all honesty, is how'd you compress it so much?
Yeah, I would think a lot of people would want to know that.
Because you shortened the cycle of it in a way I'd never seen, right?
Well, thanks, Mike.
He usually gets really red when I do that.
Well, first of all, it certainly wasn't all me, and we had a really great data team and IT team to help push the open data, and I think we worked really well together, just business model wise and people to people, of doing performance management and open data together, which I think isn't intentionally put together in a lot of places, and I think it ought to be. And I think really actually internal use of data ought to be the tip of the spear, because that's what the real people who are actually, not real people, that's like Sarah Palin saying go into real America. But the people who are not data savvy, your neighbors who is a barber, you got to show success should be gauged by whether they're actually seeing an impact in the government, not in terms of rows of data being pushed to your open data portal. So I think if you use performance management as your way to be focused on the problems facing your government, and that's how we started. And then as you do that, your data infrastructure evolves, and when you're ready and when it's good enough, you open the door to that to the public, and then you can allow more value to be reaped from that. And then I think analytics is really the next logical step for performance management shops. And I think there's a lot of performance management shops out there. I don't know how many are like solely dedicated to performance management, but
Certainly a lot more than analytics shops.
Certainly a lot more than analytics. And
but they're all looking for this. So I think that like that's the thing, and I know that like we have people here from Kansas City and from Jackson and from places that are at different points in this journey, and I think we're all looking to figure out like what is next. Like we know that like we don't want a culture of those perverse incentives. But we do know that we've made huge improvements in some of the most important ways of making our government more efficient and getting clear lines of visibility. And I think that the question now is like, isn't like, should we do this whole analytics thing, or is this a unicorn thing? This is actually like the next step. I think this is like, we're now turning over and we're seeing a lot more of our government saying like, not only do we want to be practitioners from our stat perspective or our centralized, but we want to equip our people with the skills to do this in their daily work. And how do we become now a conduit for that knowledge, so that it's not just us who's running models and thinking about data science and the way the impact it could potentially have on outcomes, but that we have our frontline practitioners who are thinking in the same way. So, like when I was a probation officer, I used to pull my hair out and say, like, I know that this family is getting other services from people on the front lines of government. I have zero visibility into that. And I don't think people were asking those questions at that time, because that was well before those other 12 years. So, and I think that that's the thing, which is like, I know this is going to work when it is our frontline practitioners who are now saying, I need analytics so that I can deliver this service better, or so that I can help my vulnerable population in a different way. And, I think it's part of the maturity of the field. I want to get to you also and bring some of your questions into this mix. So are there any questions?
Can I
wait,
ask
wait, 1 second. Yes?
She's moderating.
I'm moderating. I'm going in burst alphabetical order. So
There you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, during the first, and Avi, I wonder if you faced this dynamic too, or other people who are in the open data practitioners, but those first year or two in performance management, it was you get your authority to do your work, one, from the executive mandate, and that's critically important, but that's not sufficient. What you need is the departmental buy-in, and in order to get that buy-in, you have to show value. You have to show that the benefits of this work is going to outweigh the very real risk that can come with either showing your performance measures or your open data. Because I don't think that a rational person is going to hold on to that data if it's going to show bad news. And so you really have to look for ways that this work is going to help them personally, is going to help their careers, and is going to help them do their job better. And that's hard to do with performance management. It's really hard to do with open data. But that's why the analytics thing is so intriguing, is it helps you with that case. It's a totally different perspective of using that data. And I think it starts with them knowing what their problems are and then figuring out a way to relieve their problem in a smart way or do the most impactful work first. So I think that's why there's a really strong confluence of all those three dynamics. And that's what I hope this conversation can bring out.
Yeah. So do you want to answer that or ask my
Well,
question?
did you face those similar tensions?
There's a guy, Rick Cole, he used to be the deputy mayor of Los Angeles, who actually helped launch the open data program in LA. He could probably speak better to the initial conversations that happened there. I will say after that, moving forward, it was hard because departments were like, okay, we've opened up this data, what's happened so far? So we invested really heavily. And I have a mixed feeling around hackathons. There's a lot we can talk about there if we want to. But I invested really heavily in making hackathons focused on the departments that I wanted data from, because then I could go, so the Department of Water and Power, for instance, right? So there's a drought in California. Do you guys know about that? Take 2-minute showers. So there's we wanted data from the Department of Water and Power, and they're like, we don't know if we can give it. So we started doing a hackathon, and we hosted it at the Department of Water and Power. Right? And so that helped us get the data from them. And we pitched them on saying that these guys are going to build apps at this event focused on that. So that's the open data angle on it. Of course, the analytics angle is even stronger. But I will say, and now I'm going to transition my question, it's hard for cities. So I'm from a small town. I grew up in a city of 15,000 people, Southern Illinois. I grew up around cornfields. How many people are from small towns under 100,000 people? Right? So lots of us are, right? It's going to be hard for us in those cities to build big data teams, right? Build big analytics teams, right? And so I guess the question is, how do we scale analytics for cities, right? How do we make sure that the other than the top 10 cities have enough resources or have the capability and skill set to make sure that they can do the same kind of important work that we're all agreeing is vital?
So, I think Beth is working on it. I think there needs to be a number of sharings of learnings, right, that happen. Most of the contacts I've had with other cities has just been like kind of because of my personal network, right? Like people will reach out and I'll have a profanity-laden phone call with them.
I've had that call. You should try it.
And then send them all my memos and stuff, right? And and I'm more than happy to do that, but that's not exactly scalable, right? Whereas if you're capable, and then the other thing is, by the way, I think I'm not being paid by him to say these things, but one of the things that Oliver did that I really like a lot is he put all his code up on GitHub for everybody to use, right? That's good stuff, right? I didn't do anything like that in New York because I didn't even care about the rest of the country. My job was I was being paid by New York City taxpayers, so I focused on New York City. And the fact of the matter is, I think you sort of have to keep that mind frame while at the same time, think about setting up a network of people with whom to share, which is, I think, so I'm actually going to punt this over to Beth. Because I think the best hope we've got of spreading this to places that don't have a ton of resources is to lay out an infrastructure for people to be able to access that insight.
Yeah, so I'm actively working on this, and I'm trying to do it in a way where I learn from the mistakes of the past. And so I come from government. I started working in government in year 2000, one of the biggest disappointments that I had when working for government and trying to have an impact in government was the relationship that government had with the private sector and how malicious, in my opinion, it was, where we were locked into these multi-million-dollar agreements with both our technology providers, but also with consultants and with our universities. And we were we had no leverage or power. And so I made it sort of my passion in life to low cost or no cost alternatives to this. And one of the things that I don't want to do with this work, particularly around analytics, is to I think that the mistake that would be made is that we would have to empower big consulting firms to be the only ones who could come in and do this type of work with cities. And I think what we're trying to do at Hopkins is to provide that to cities for no cost, and to encourage an openness around the way that the programs can be built up. Now, you're going to have to invest sometimes in technology, and you're going to have to invest sometimes in some resources or a developer or something. But the more that we can get out there and do this in a way that's open and transparent, and that if Oliver's figured it out, you shouldn't have to pay Oliver to have some other person learn what Oliver did and then come to your city and try to train you, when it would just be easier for Oliver to check his code into Gitbook and then into GitHub, and then for us to be able to help a city understand how they can extract that value and knowledge. And so the first thing is how do we not put how do we create an open knowledge exchange amongst cities, and doing that through the framework of this network. So that's what we're doing.
And then one more thing I kind of want to throw on there, right?
Yep.
Just like real quick.
Okay.
The fact is that there are certain processes and certain kind of ways of doing things that are easily this is going to work for. But there's also something else I think that's like, I am an attorney, and in law school you are mandated to take an ethics class. And I remember sitting there, and they would say things like, well, don't put yourself in your client's will, and things like that. And I'm just thinking, like, at this stage of the game, if you have to learn that, then you're a sociopath, So there's just some qualitative things that I think you always have to bring with you and wear on your sleeve.
Right.
Right? I am here to help. You can trust me. I'm not going to screw you over. Right? Lead from the front. Stick your neck out. If things go bad, take the blame. Like, these are things that are very qualitative and yet exceedingly important, and all those other things, these learnings we're talking about, the manuals and what, they mean nothing if you're not in it for the right reason.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that, the first thing is, I'm not going to be putting you in my will. No,
Not
but
even me.
definitely not. No, just kidding. Anyways, but the idea here is for us to leverage this. Cities we need to put cities back in the pole position when it comes to figuring out what works best for them, and then make them create peer networks so that they can help each other accomplish what their missions are, and do that in a way that's well documented, that has standards, that has scalability, and that is easily replicable, so that we can all be really good at being second at something, which is something I say a lot. So I'd love to open it up to a question.
Hey, so when you're working on a project and you're done analytically and you've got some insights, how do you get the department to do something about it? I mean, have you ever given something to them and they just don't know how to make any changes because it's really complicated, and there's actually 5 departments involved, and nothing happens with the insight that you glean?
Well, I mean, I would submit that you shouldn't have even started until they were bought in. You've wasted your time.
But have you ever run into a situation where they not only bought in, but ask you to do something about it, but then when you're done, you bring it back to them, and they don't know how to implement it, or they just don't implement it, it's no longer a priority, or they don't know, it's too complicated to implement it?
I mean, I can't say I ran into that. What I can tell you is that I had good leadership backing, and so I made sure that everything I was doing all along the way, it was a very iterative process. There were moments when they would come back and be like, I don't like this too much, and then when you would dig down deep into why, it was because maybe they didn't have the resources to act on it, so then I got to go get them the resources to act on it, right? And if I ever, I can't say I really fully ever dealt with a finished product not being used just by the nature of how I went about doing my work, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't happen. I don't know. Did you run into that?
I've had those, but I would call them mistakes on our part, not mistakes on the department's part. And I think that's part of your, if you're doing it right, the department should be there every step along the way. And your analyst should have figured out their problems inside and out on how and what the department's business needs are. So it's not the project is, but one example of it's not a failure yet because I think we're still trying to work out the kinks. But one conversation we had with our public works director is, traffic safety is important, obviously. Do you think it would be helpful if we did a map of where all the accidents are so we could identify the most dangerous intersections? And he said, yeah, sure. And so we went about doing that analysis, which sounds pretty simple. And then we delivered the map. And then we had the conversation, well, now what are you going to do about it? And we didn't have that conversation up front. Like, clearly it was like, yes, that would be useful. But we had it mapped out, all right, so if you had that, what exactly would you do? Do you have money to invest in re-engineering some intersections? Do we have some overtime budget we can give to the cops to do some special enforcement around those intersections? And so now we're having those conversations now, and that protracts that time from insight to actual impact, because we didn't have those conversations at the beginning of what you would actually do with it. We knew there was interest in it, but that was abstracted from actually some policy action that was going to be taken on that insight.
I would just add, so we didn't have that problem when I was there, but to echo that point, everything comes down to budget. Tim, you work in a city, you know that. Everything comes down to budget, right? You can't innovate without understanding what the budget is. And so if you go into a project and don't know how the department's going to reorient their budget to actually make that project happen, it's a false start, right? So you have to understand the budget process and how the budget's going to play out for that department based on that project. And if you don't, it's a non-starter. You're just not going to get anywhere.
Or you have to have levers. I don't know if it's necessarily all money. I think there's levers, right? So one of the things that we had, I didn't have an open checkbook to go and write lots of checks to different people, but I could there were some barriers or challenges that agencies were facing that were just I could eliminate red tape, or I could get the governor to weigh in on a decision that's been kind of lingering. And sometimes that's all it took. So it's important to understand that you need to make sure that you have the ability to rapidly deploy resources if that's what is called for. But I also think that there's 5 or 6 low-hanging fruit layers that seem like low-hanging fruit to you that the agencies are really struggling with. And if you can have just some of those levers that you can quickly pull, whether it's quickly reclassify a position, quickly eliminate some kind of weird procurement fake barrier, all of those things, then I think that there are ways for you to to gin up more without just solely being about budget. Yep.
So I work for a vendor. We do case management software for child protective services.
Casebook.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this isn't a question on behalf of kids. But I guess I'm wondering how your teams balance kind of just answering the question with the data that you have and figuring out kind of all of the turtles all the way down. What was the business practice that spawned these set of answers? And also, how do you guys communicate that with vendors so that they can provide information to their users who are frontline workers?
So great that a vendor's asking the question, because in my experience, it wasn't asked a lot from the vendor perspective. And so a lot of my interactions with vendors were mostly please, can you help me? I really need this data and I don't want to pay you $650,000 for a report. And those were the types of conversations. So, and I worked for a vendor very happily for a long time. So, I think that we have to sort of change and shift and our thinking in some of these areas. But I think that for us, some of the most fruitful conversations from an analytics perspective, from a stat perspective, and from an open data perspective was asking the wrong questions. So being in the room and actually just having conversations and saying, well, I think your data is telling you this, and being able to be deferential to the subject matter expertise that exists in your agencies, and for them to be able to say, you're wrong, and for you to be able to say, okay, have that prompt a much more fruitful conversation about how to identify a solution to that problem or help influence that policy. I think that is incredibly helpful. But from a vendor perspective, to just be agile and to want to help solve the problem is always, in my opinion, very helpful. And I don't know if you have any other experience.
Yeah, I mean, I too am a vendor, although not the government now. But I think, and this is going to sound really cheesy, but there's an anthropology behind the data that needs to be understood when you begin using it and interpreting it and everything else that you do, right? And I think your job as a vendor is to do as deep a dive on that as it is to get the technological / data science part of it correct. Does that make you understand what I'm saying? Like, there's just tons of probing, like going on site, right? And the reality that's reflected in that data you're analyzing, have you done an eyes on it? Have you done an eyes on the people doing the work that data purports to reflect? And I say purports for a good reason, right? Because it is a very, very pixelated view of reality, frankly. And so the deeper understanding you can get of the reality that data says it's reflecting, the better off you're going to be. If a city or a client isn't willing to provide you that, or isn't able to provide you that, then I think that you got a lot of problem, like a big problem, right?
Yeah, there's actually two things I want to say about this. One is just the issue of asking the right questions in the city. So there's a funny story with the Los Angeles Personnel Department. They said, Avi, hey, we want to build a mobile app for recruiting police officers. Is it going to be a first-person shooter? What do you want to do with a mobile app for recruiting police officers? And it turned out that really what they wanted to do was to optimize their website to be mobile responsive, right? But they didn't understand that, right? So I had to spend a lot of time talking with them to get them to understand that, right? So I think that's one side of it, right? Is having the champions internally, right? CDOs, CAOs, CPOs, whatever, who are going to push departments and ask better questions, right? But I think on the flip side, and I would just say this as someone who I probably got, you guys know this too, I probably got 25 vendor emails a day and maybe 15 calls a day. I almost change my number, right? Because it just got so much. And so I'd say as a vendor, and Rebecca, you were a CFA fellow, right? I mean, solve problems that really exist. Don't just try to sell your software, right? And I think if vendors took up that same ethos that I was trying to take up in the city, right, of solving the real problem, I think we'd solve a lot of problems. If that makes sense.
Any other? Yep.
So if you're a chief data officer or you're a director of analytics and you're working with a department, it stands to reason that you have some insight into, if you were able to collect this data, we could have a higher fidelity model or we could get a better prediction that the department themselves wouldn't necessarily know. So you guys are kind of in a privileged position to be able to work with the department and say, hey, why don't you guys collect this kind of data, or why don't you, get the ball rolling on collecting this data in this different way, so that our job is easier. Have you had any experience doing that? Do you think that's an appropriate role for the analytics department? What do you think about that sort of symbiosis?
I don't think that's a good thing to ask.
So yeah. I'm going to try to translate for you a little bit, but so the people that are working in government are overburdened as is with what they have to do just to do what they're required to do. And so I think that sometimes we jump at trying to get at what can you now new production of data when there already is so much data that's just readily available that just inventorying the data that exists is probably going to get you very close to where you need to be, if not where you need to be from an analytics perspective. And it's trying, I think our roles and the roles of a lot of you in the room is to reduce the friction of getting data out and not to create additional requirements on top of what already is a very overburdened workforce. That being said, you can, if you really want to get at new data, or if you want to change the way that data is provided, you can lead an agency to making that conclusion on their own by illustrating the problem that you're going to solve and by continuously having that conversation around the way that the data can impact the solution. And that is a way to do it, but it is very artful, and the last thing you want to do is to create a chilling effect in your government that is like, oh, well, there's the lady that's just going to make me do more feed the beast kind of data reporting.
Why is she pointing at me when she says that?
No, I'm the lady. I'm the lady, and that's my like.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with both of them. I think it's a terrible idea, right? Because of what Beth said, right? I mean, they're not even using what they got. So you got to get them there, and then you can sort of start thinking about doing new stuff. And if you're going to collect new stuff in a new way, you need to prove why, right? Because I heard what you said, and if I put on my civil servant hat, I hear, how much is this going to cost, right? And what are the processes, and what are the regulatory aspects of this that are going to have to change? Just the cultural, political, and legal issues surrounding a data change of some kind. However, there are other things that you can do, right? Such as bringing other data sources that are readily available to the table, right? In an elegant way. If you have a small footprint extraction and synthesizing capacity, that goes very far too. And I guess, the thing you just constantly have to remember is that those who go in right out of the chute and say, you need to change this and you need to change that, are really just never get anywhere. Mm-hmm. And I actually think it really speaks to a fundamental divide between the civic technology community and local government, right? There's just a total lack of understanding sometimes on both sides of, why they're doing what they're doing, right? And I think that data, I know that wasn't really what you were asking, but a data change conversation is sort of one of those things that always came up every time we met with the larger outside community. And when you talk to the agencies, it's like, you got to be kidding me. How am I going to pull that off when they're already slicing me at 10%?
I would just add, I think the best way to get new data is new digital services. So if you build new applications and tools for departments to actually do their jobs, right? Do their day-to-day jobs, you're going to get great data from that. Particularly, it's going to be 10 times better than OCRing the paper records that you're doing right now, right? This happened in Los Angeles with our street sweepers, right? So, or sanitation department, rather. They built an ArcGIS tool that let them track where all the trucks were, and we got so much great open data from them, 10 times better than the Thomas guides, which, by the way, before I worked for the city, I had no idea what those were. Now I know. They're terrible. I had no idea what they were, but now we get great data from them. So I think digital services gets you good data, right? And so if you want to get new data, make new digital services.
And for those of you that are working in smaller governments that don't have the capacity to create centralized digital service, you can seek out professional development. And that has a huge impact on culture. So even just bringing in subject matter expertise to come and speak to your city and to help guide them through a process, or to really or to create a certification for doing some of this work, and to start to proliferate the skill set that's required to do some of this work in your government, can be incredibly helpful to getting traction and getting people more willing to kind of evolve to your thinking and to start thinking about how to be more creative in problem solving.
Yeah, I mean, I think you always have to be mindful of the benefit, that the benefit has to outweigh the costs. And so you have to be very, very careful if you're going to introduce new labor requirements from the departments to collect data. Even if it's going to pay for itself in the long term, you just got to be very careful with that. Just one example, Mike and I worked on this project with smoke alarms in New Orleans. There was a terrible tragedy last fall where 3 kids and their mom and grandma died in a house fire in New Orleans, and that house had no smoke alarms. So the fire chief wanted to be much more proactive, and he wanted to do everything in his power to make sure that we were preventing deaths like that from occurring. And so we worked with him on a way to figure out which census block groups are most in need of having a smoke alarm, because one, they're in an area that is they're least likely to have one, and 2, where there's a high risk of fire fatalities. And when we started that project, what we were going to do is basically do a data collection phase and then do an experiment of the certain types of profiles based on empirical data we would collect. Is it going to be, can we glean insights from that to help them prioritize work in the future? But it turned out that in order to do something like that, you'd have to collect so much data and go to so many houses that the whole point of making their lives easier and going out to do the most impactful work first, you're like defeating the whole purpose. So we went, but it forced us to go back to the drawing board to look at existing data sets. And we used like good old-fashioned American Community Survey, American Housing Survey data, which is not like big data or doing text mining from Twitter or anything like that. It was just like good old-fashioned federal data sources. And we found a way
Super out of date and unreliable. It's the federal way.
But no, actually really, really useful.
Yeah, it's really useful.
To model, we developed a way to find the American Housing Survey, which is administered at the county level, asked, do you have a smoke alarm or not? But it's only at the county level. So we figured out a way to develop a model to extrapolate that insight to the census block group level. And that was the big value add to the department. And that required no expenditure of resources. It was all free data. We did all the modeling in-house and with pro bono support from my good friend on my left and his employer, Enigma. And then by the time we got to the firefighters, then they loved it because it was like they were invested in the project. They didn't have to expend any resources to do it. We just gave something that was all a carrot. It was all
and it was actionable.
And that last piece is really important. They did like it.
Yeah.
We took what we did with Oliver's group, right? And then because it was federal data, at Enigma, we just kind of made a map for the whole country, right? And then just said, okay, load your incidents and we can figure something out, right? And we'll spit out a list of addresses and you can use that to prioritize your door knocks, right? Nice, basic, actionable stuff. Released it a week ago, right? But the thing about it that sort of surprised me, to be honest with you, is the outreach we've gotten from local departments. I mean, I'm related to a lot of these first responders. I'm related to a lot of first responders, right? And the reality is they are a paranoiac, cultish group, right? And I say that with much love. The reality, the thing that surprises me is that we've got an overwhelming reach out from them saying like, hey, man, this is cool. Can I send you our CAD data? Now, CAD data, God, it's like the holy grail of public data, really right? Is. And because it's the worst stuff your city sees on a day-to-day basis, right? And so all that showed, as Oliver said, the crappy federal data that we managed to turn into an actionable piece, actionable little tool is going to incentivize the release of some of the most wonderfully under-leveraged yet most valuable local intelligence that's out there. So I think that's how I would look at it. There is existing data within cities that is of exceedingly high value if used the right way and with respect for those who act on it.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing which will throw a little bit of water on this great story, because I love this story, and in fact, I try to do this same project. I saw Oliver's code on GitHub, try to redo it myself, and I'm not nearly good enough a coder to actually do that myself, so sorry. I actually asked him for help. He helped, but it didn't work. What happened was we almost got close to doing this in LA, and turned out there are labor issues with the fire department actually being able to go into houses and check the fire alarms or check if they have fire detectors.
Yeah, no, and that's true.
But that's a great policy change.
There are local idiosyncrasies, obviously, that you must take into account.
That's what I'm trying to say. As you work on these analytics things, is we have to keep in mind, because I had no idea that was going to be a problem, right, going into it, right? And so being aware of the political reality, being aware of the local idiosyncrasies, like understanding what's happening there, I think is vital, because you can't just go in and say, I'm going to do this, this, and this, without understanding what's already there.
Make a code annotation in GitHub with that as one of the first things. Like, here's a threshold question.
Yeah.
Is this going to be able to happen? Yeah. Is a good way. I want to get to more questions.
So I have an operational question. How long were the projects that you were having
I mean,
That's you.
everybody's different. Some of them were really long. Anything having to do with 911 took a long time. Some of them were real fast. You know, it just depended. The team itself, I think everybody picks their own team. I picked who I was comfortable with. Statistical capacity, certain affability, right, and some qualitative skill sets about could they manage under a high stress environment with a team setting, right? That's what I looked for, but that worked for me. I think everybody has their own style and way of doing things, and you know, it'll reflect the environment in which they find themselves.
I started off with 2 people and me, and I had to basically make justifications every quarter for getting more people on board, and I had to show savings or some kind of ROI, even non-traditional GDP ROI. So if I was having an impact that was directly felt in the community, or if I was saving taxpayer money, then I could hire more people.
I'm one of 7 on my team, to answer that one of your questions. In terms of project length, it really does depend, I think, but it's also a matter of the projects that you go out and select. So I think we've gone out and selected projects that take about 6 months to do, which are going to be not so ambitious that you're never going to get it done, and it's just going to be this big project that you love to get done, but you're never actually going to see success. But it's also something meaningful enough that it's really going to change the way the department does business, and that's going to take time. I don't think you can get do meaningful work on just doing really short, ad hoc maps or something like that take a week or 2 to produce.
So the way LA handled it was a little different than some of the other cities. We didn't actually have an in-house data science team. So the way we would actually handle it is we'd partner with local universities. So for instance, we did a project around reducing pedestrian and auto collisions to 0. It's called Vision Zero. And we did that with a local university, USC. So it took about 6 months. And so they had about 20 to 25 grad students working on it, which is great, right? Because you get a bunch of horsepower. It's a little different than having a core team in-house that you can manage and control. But again, we didn't have the resources to be able to hire that. And so we actually found a creative way to get it done using outside and partnerships.
So I'm like the worst panel moderator because I have no idea what time this ends, but it sounds like it's ending in other places. So I just so I want to take this opportunity to thank the panel and for doing this. So thank you. Big round of applause.